Welcome to the channel. Today, we delve into a case that haunted Belgrade, Montana for nearly 3 decades, the disappearance and murder of 15-year-old Danielle Hajins. In today's video, we're looking at the disappearance of Danielle Hajins, a case that stayed with her community for decades. Danielle was just 15 years old when she left her home in Belgrade, Montana, for a walk on a quiet afternoon in September of 1996. She never came back. Her family reported her missing almost right away. At first, it was treated like any other missing person case, but as the hours passed, concern quickly turned into fear. Then, just a few days later, something was found along the Gallatin River that changed everything. Investigators were no longer just searching for a missing teenager. They were now working a homicide investigation. For years, the case went nowhere. There were no arrests, no clear suspects, and no real answers. Danielle's family and the people who knew her were left waiting, wondering what happened and whether the truth would ever come out. Then, in 2021, more than 20 years later, the case took an unexpected turn. DNA evidence that had been preserved all that time was finally tested at a lab thousands of miles away. That testing uncovered a connection no one had seen before and pointed investigators to a man who had never been part of the original investigation. Danielle Hajins was a high school student living in Belgrade, a small town just west of Bozeman. People who knew her described her as kind, thoughtful, and quietly curious about the world around her. She lived with her family in a neighborhood close to the local high school and was a sophomore at Belgrade Secondary School. She wasn't someone who drew a lot of attention to herself. She did well in school, took part in some activities, and showed up when she was supposed to. Teachers remembered her as polite and dependable. Friends said she was quiet and kept a small group of close friends, but she was loyal and caring once you got to know her. There were no signs that Danielle was heading down a dangerous path. She had no history of getting into trouble, no disciplinary issues, and no record of risky behavior. Her home life appeared stable, and there had never been any reports of problems or police involvement. She had never run away before, and there was nothing to suggest she was trying to disappear. The last confirmed sighting of Danielle was on the afternoon of September 21, 1996. She left her house that day planning to go for a walk or possibly to meet someone near the Cameron Bridge Road area, a familiar spot along the Gallatin River. But, according to witnesses, she never met anyone there, and to this day, her family is still searching for answers about where she went and what happened after she walked out the door. When Danielle didn't come home that evening, her family grew worried. By the next morning, they contacted the Belgrade Police Department and reported her missing. She had left dressed for the warm September weather and hadn't taken much with her. No bag, no wallet, nothing that suggested she planned to be gone long. If she rode her bike that day, it was never located. Search efforts started right away. Volunteers and local officers combed nearby roads, fields, and the wooded areas along the river. For the first few days, Danielle was officially listed as missing, and there was no clear sign that a crime had taken place. Investigators spoke with her family, neighbors, friends, and classmates, but no one had heard from her or received any kind of message. School records showed that Danielle never returned to class after September 21st. Her photo and details were shared across Gallatin County and appeared in local news coverage. A few tips came in, but none of them led to confirmed sightings or useful leads. As the days passed with no word from Danielle, investigators began to worry that something more serious had happened. Her family made it clear they didn't believe she had run away. She had left behind all of her personal belongings, and there was nothing in her history that pointed in that direction. With help from the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, authorities issued a statewide alert in hopes of generating new information. Despite the increased effort, leads remained scarce. The case didn't draw much national attention, and without a body, a suspect, or physical evidence, the investigation slowly lost momentum. Local news outlets continued to mention Danielle's case from time to time, but there were no major developments. The investigation stayed open, though largely inactive. Each year, the Sheriff's Office released reminders, and Danielle Hajins' name was eventually added to national databases of unresolved cases. For years, there were no answers about what had happened to her. Then, on the morning of September 27, 1996, 6 days after she was reported missing, Danielle Hajins' body was discovered in a remote marsh near the Gallatin River in Gallatin County, Montana. A local resident who was in the area for unrelated reasons noticed something out of place in the brush and shallow water. Realizing what he had found, he left the area immediately and called emergency services. Deputies from the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office arrived first. They secured the scene and limited access to authorized personnel as the investigation took a devastating turn. The area stayed secured for about 45 minutes as officers began documenting the scene. They worked roughly 40 feet from the riverbank, taking photographs, marking boundaries, and writing down details about the surroundings. Danielle's body was partly in the water, hidden by cattails and thick grass, which made it difficult to see from a distance. During that first assessment, investigators didn't notice any obvious signs of a struggle nearby. There were no drag marks, no tire tracks, and nothing in the ground that suggested a fight had taken place in that spot. The exact location was logged using a handheld GPS so it could be precisely recorded. Danielle wasn't carrying any personal items. There were no shoes, no wallet, and no form of identification found near her. She was still wearing clothes, though, and the condition of the plants around her suggested she had been there for several days. Investigators also noted that water levels in the marsh had dropped slightly after she disappeared, which may explain why her body hadn't been visible earlier. At first, identification was based on what her family described. Her clothing and physical features matched what Danielle had been wearing the day she was last seen. Because of the condition of her remains, the forensic process was moved forward quickly. Within 48 hours, the Montana State Forensic Laboratory in Missoula confirmed through dental records that the victim was Danielle Marie Hajins. An autopsy was carried out by the State Forensic Medical Service. Her death was officially ruled a homicide, though the exact cause was never shared publicly. Later on, parts of the autopsy report were revised and released in response to media and public requests. Investigators also confirmed that no weapons or shell casings were found at the scene. The injuries Danielle suffered were determined to be intentional, not the results of an accident or natural causes. Toxicology tests were performed, but those results were not included in the information made public. After the initial assessment, a full forensic team returned to the site. They collected water samples to test for contaminants or foreign biological material, along with soil samples from beneath and around the body. Danielle's clothing and the surrounding vegetation were also examined closely for hairs, fibers, or anything else that might help explain what happened. All of the evidence collected from the scene was carefully logged, labeled, and sent to the state forensic lab where it was preserved under a strict chain of custody. Back in 1996, DNA testing was still limited, and none of the samples matched anything in CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. Investigators knew technology might improve over time, so the evidence was stored in refrigerated conditions in case it could be tested again in the future. The area itself offered very little to work with. There were no surveillance cameras, no traffic monitoring, and very little nearby development or regular activity. In the week after Danielle disappeared, law enforcement went door to door within about a 2-meter radius. They also spoke with utility workers, ranch hands, and landowners who spent time in the area. No one reported seeing Danielle, and no one noticed unfamiliar people or vehicles. One landowner mentioned hearing a car late on the night of September 21st, but that information couldn't be confirmed. By that point, the Belgrade Police Department had turned full control of the case over to the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. As details began to reach the public, a liaison officer from the Montana Department of Justice was assigned to help coordinate communication between agencies and support the investigation. Bulletins from Montana law enforcement and coverage from local media quickly followed. Even with flyers posted, media alerts issued, and repeated outreach to the community, investigators were unable to identify any suspects. The sheriff's office formally confirmed Danielle's death and classified the case as a homicide. At a public briefing on October 3, 1996, authorities shared only limited information and declined to go into further detail. Between October 1996 and March 1997, more than 100 tips came in through phone calls, mailed letters, and anonymous reports. Every tip was logged, reviewed, and followed up on where possible. Still, none of them led to a suspect or produced solid evidence. When compared against existing records, the information simply didn't point anywhere. Tests on fibers and latent fingerprints taken from Danielle's clothing came back inconclusive. Environmental swabs and soil samples were preserved, but they didn't link the scene to any specific person or object. Despite months of work, the investigation reached a standstill, not from lack of effort, but from a lack of usable answers. Even after all the early fieldwork, investigators were left with major unanswered questions. They couldn't determine how Danielle ended up at the location where she was found, whether she had been taken there from somewhere else, or if another crime scene existed entirely. There was no clear answer about where her body had originally been placed or how long it had been there before it was discovered. By the end of 1997, the investigation had stalled. Every piece of evidence had been reviewed using the tools and resources available at the time, but nothing pointed to a suspect. No arrests were made. In early 1998, the case was officially marked inactive. All biological samples and physical evidence were carefully documented and archived. They were stored under climate-controlled conditions at the Montana State Forensic Laboratory, and access was restricted to formal requests through law enforcement. While the case was no longer active, it wasn't forgotten. Between 1998 and 2019, the Gallatin County Unsolved Cases Unit, a small team formed in the early 2000s to review unresolved violent crimes, periodically revisited Danielle's case. Each time, the conclusion was the same. There were no new leads, but the biological evidence needed to be preserved as forensic science continued to improve. That recommendation would eventually matter. After forensic genetic genealogy began solving high-profile cold cases around the country, Gallatin County Sheriff Dan Springer approved a new review of Danielle Hajins' case. The biological evidence collected back in 1996 was selected for deeper testing using modern methods. To do that, the sheriff's office partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a private company that specializes in DNA analysis for law enforcement investigations. Using next-generation sequencing, the preserved samples were examined again, something that simply wasn't possible in the 1990s. This marked the first real shift in the case in decades. In 2021, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office officially reopened the investigation into Danielle Hajins' murder. Working alongside Parabon Nanolabs, investigators retrieved and analyzed biological samples that had been stored since 1996. Among them were several strands of hair that had remained intact despite the limits of earlier testing. Previous attempts to analyze that material had gone nowhere. This time, it was different. Using newer technology, investigators were able to develop a usable DNA profile from one of the preserved samples. The profile didn't match anyone in criminal databases and wasn't found in the FBI's combined DNA index system. But for the first time, they had something solid to work with. And that changed everything. Parabon Nanolabs then used forensic genetic genealogy to help investigators trace the source of the DNA. The profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database where researchers began building family trees and mapping genetic connections. Over time, they identified a small group of people who shared key markers with the unknown male profile. Those connections led back to a family with roots in northwestern Montana. After months of careful analysis and cross-checking, the focus narrowed to one individual, Paul Edwin Hutchinson, born in 1969, was living in Dillon, Montana at the time. He had no prior arrests, had never come up in the original investigation, and wasn't known to Gallatin County law enforcement. His name didn't appear in any criminal databases. In early 2023, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office quietly began looking into Hutchinson's background. Their goal was to obtain a DNA sample without drawing attention. Under state law, investigators collected an item Hutchinson had discarded that was believed to contain his saliva. When it was tested, the results were clear. The DNA was a full match to the profile developed from the evidence in Danielle Hajins' case. With that confirmation, Hutchinson became the primary suspect. A face-to-face interview was scheduled for July 22, 2023. When contacted, Hutchinson agreed to speak with investigators. The interview took place in Dillon and lasted less than 2 hours, and it was formally recorded. During the conversation, Hutchinson denied any involvement. He said he had never been to the Cameron Bridge area in 1996 and claimed he didn't know Danielle. But investigators noticed a shift when they showed him a photo of her. He appeared visibly nervous, sweating, fidgeting, and avoiding eye contact. After the interview, law enforcement began putting together a formal case to present to the Gallatin County prosecutor. More supporting evidence was being gathered, and a second interview was planned. That interview never happened. Less than 24 hours later, on the morning of July 23, 2023, Hutchinson's residence called 911. First responders arrived and found him deceased. His death was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Investigators found no signs of third-party involvement, and firearms were recovered at the scene. Following his death, additional DNA testing was conducted using a buccal swab. The results confirmed a precise match to the DNA profile connected to the 1996 crime scene. After nearly 3 decades, investigators finally had an answer, even if it came without the chance for a trial or a full explanation of what happened. No other suspects have been publicly named, and investigators have not said that Paul Hutchinson had any known connection to Danielle Hajins. As of now, there's no clear evidence that the two ever knew each other or had any kind of relationship. After the DNA results were confirmed, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office formally closed the homicide investigation as it related to the suspect's death. With Hutchinson deceased, no additional charges are expected. That said, the Sheriff's Office is still reviewing the legal and procedural steps needed to officially document Hutchinson's involvement in Danielle's 1996 murder, following his death on July 23, 2023. The DNA profile obtained from Hutchinson was directly compared to the biological evidence preserved from Danielle's body. The Montana State Forensic Laboratory confirmed it was a complete match. Once that connection was established, investigators took a closer look at Hutchinson's background, including his work history, past residences, and travel patterns. At the time of the crime, Hutchinson was living in Montana within about 100 meters of where Danielle was found. Even so, his name never came up during the original investigation. There's no record of him being interviewed, mentioned by witnesses, or flagged as a person of interest back in 1996. A review of phone records, school records, and community ties didn't reveal any link between Hutchinson and Danielle. Employment and property records show that in 1996, Hutchinson was working in a regional travel-related role based out of Dillon, Montana. Investigators believe it's possible he could have been near Belgrade that day because of work, but there's no evidence that places him there with certainty. Both in 1996 and again during the renewed investigation in 2023, police found no digital communications, letters, journals, or written materials that might explain his actions or shed light on why he may have been in the area. Investigators also spoke with people who knew Hutchinson following standard procedures. None of them reported any suspicion or knowledge of his involvement in the crime. Hutchinson had no prior arrests for violent offenses. There were no records of mental health commitments, no civil cases, and no restraining orders tied to his name. After the forensic results linking Hutchinson to Danielle's murder were confirmed, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office held a press conference in August 2023 to share what they could with the public and formally acknowledge the outcome of the investigation. At the press conference, authorities confirmed that the identified suspect was deceased and that DNA evidence had brought the Danielle Hajins case to a close. No other persons of interest were named. It was the first time in nearly 20 years that law enforcement publicly acknowledged they had identified the person responsible. The sheriff's office also spoke about the role forensic genetic genealogy played in reaching that point. They credited outside partners, including Parabon Nanolabs, and noted that without this technology, the case likely would have remained unsolved, particularly given the limitations investigators faced in Belgrade and Dillon at the time. News of the case resolution was covered by media outlets across Montana and picked up by several national organizations. Public records show that no legal claims or civil actions have been filed against Hutchinson's estate following his death. The Hutchinson family released a short statement saying they were relieved the case had been resolved and asked for privacy moving forward. No additional criminal charges were filed, and the Montana Department of Justice officially classified the case as resolved by identification. While the case is no longer considered active, the file remains available to law enforcement under restricted access, preserving the record of what happened and how the investigation ultimately reached its conclusion. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post crime case videos every night. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant.